Picture a medieval landscape where the swift flight of a falcon carried more than just the promise of a hunt. It carried secrets, high above the castles and monasteries, beyond the reach of prying eyes. These birds of prey were part of a clandestine network, their routes weaving an invisible web of knowledge. For centuries, falconry was revered as the sport of kings, a symbol of power and prestige. But beneath its noble surface lay a daring secret. Falconers were the unsung couriers of forbidden books, smuggling manuscripts that challenged the rigid doctrines of their time. This is the story of how the art of falconry became a lifeline for ideas too dangerous to be left in the open. Think about the sheer audacity of it, a falconer, trusted by the elite, moving freely between courts and remote estates, their birds carrying more than just game. Hidden in the lining of leather gloves or tucked into specially crafted compartments in falconry boxes were pages of philosophy, science, and theology deemed too radical for the masses. These weren't just books, they were sparks of rebellion, ideas that could topple empires or ignite revolutions. And the falconers, they were the quiet revolutionaries, risking everything to ensure knowledge survived. Their story is one of courage and cunning, a testament to the lengths people will go to protect the freedom to think. What makes this tale even more fascinating is how perfectly falconry served as a cover. Birds of prey were prized possessions, their movements rarely questioned. A falconer traveling from one kingdom to another was just another servant of the crown. No one would suspect they were part of a shadowy trade in forbidden texts. Monasteries, often the keepers of knowledge, became unlikely allies, with some monks secretly copying and distributing banned works. The very institutions meant to control thought became nodes in this underground network. So why has this story remained hidden for so long? Perhaps because the best secrets are the ones that leave no trace. But today, we're pulling back the curtain on this extraordinary alliance between falconry and the fight for intellectual freedom. Get ready to uncover a history where the sky wasn't the limit, it was the delivery system. Falconry arrived in medieval Europe like a whisper on the wind, carried by merchants and diplomats from the East. By the 8th century, it had become far more than a pastime. It was a language of power, a way for kings and lords to demonstrate their sophistication. But what few realized was that this elite tradition also created something extraordinary, a hidden infrastructure. Training falcons required vast distances. Birds had to be transported from nesting grounds to royal courts, then exchanged between nobles as gifts or diplomatic gestures. Over time, these routes became as predictable as trade roads, yet far less scrutinized. After all, who would question a falconer riding through the gates of a castle with a prized peregrine on their arm? The genius of this system lay in its invisibility. While merchants faced tolls and inspections at every border, falconers moved with rare freedom. Their work demanded access to remote forests and high-walled estates, places where ordinary travelers would raise suspicion. They knew the back roads, the unguarded paths between kingdoms, and crucially, they carried leather satchels and wooden boxes, tools of their trade that could easily conceal slim volumes or folded parchments. When a nobleman received a new hawk from a distant land, who would think to check the lining of its transport cage? What's remarkable is how this network mirrored the very nature of the ideas it helped spread. Like falcons, forbidden books were creatures of precision and power. A single text could soar across borders, striking at the heart of dogma with terrifying speed. The same hands that trained birds to hunt could stitch manuscripts into saddlebags or hollow out staffs to hide scrolls. And just as falconry required patience, waiting for the perfect moment to release the bird, these couriers knew when to move, when to stay silent. They understood that the safest way to transport dangerous knowledge was to make it look like something else entirely. This wasn't just clever logistics, it was alchemy. The mundane tools of falconry, jesses, hoods, even the birds themselves became instruments of intellectual rebellion. A goshawk's arrival at a monastery might mean fresh meat for the table, or it might mean Aristotle's forbidden works slipping into the hands of a curious monk. The system thrived because it hid in plain sight, wrapped in the pageantry of nobility. While kings obsessed over the quality of their birds, the real treasure was passing right under their noses, carried on the wings of the very sport they loved. By the 12th century, the walls were closing in on free thought. Kings and bishops, united in their fear of dissent, turned manuscripts into contraband. Books arguing the earth revolved around the sun, questioning the divine right of rulers, or exploring ancient Greek philosophy vanished from public view, sometimes literally going up in smoke. But you can't burn curiosity out of the human spirit. For every pyre of banned texts, there were a dozen scholars whispering in cloisters, nobles trading forbidden volumes under banquet tables, and yes, falconers adjusting the straps of their gloves to hide folded parchment. The irony is delicious. The same institutions that bred these magnificent birds to symbolize control became the loophole in their own system. Take the case of a 15th century German treatise on astronomy, declared heresy for challenging the Church's view of the heavens. While officials raided libraries, a single copy traveled 200 miles inside the hollowed-out perch of a gyrfalcon's traveling cage. The nobleman who received it, a cardinal's own brother who'd paid the falconer in silver to forget what he'd carried. What made these texts so dangerous wasn't just their ideas, it was who might read them. A peasant couldn't challenge papal doctrine if they never learned to read, but universities and noble courts were full of literate minds itching for debate. That's why the punishment for smuggling books often exceeded theft or even treason. In France, a monk caught with an unauthorized translation of the Bible had his hands severed before his execution, a grim warning to anyone tempted to traffic in knowledge. Yet the trade flourished because falconers operated in the blind spot between power and suspicion. Consider the logistics. A merchant's wagon would be torn apart at city gates, every crate inspected. But a falconer's equipment, too valuable to risk damaging. Those embroidered hoods shielding a bird's eyes could also shield a slim volume of poetry praising humanism. The jesses, those thin leather straps on a falcon's legs, could be unstitched, filled with vellum, then resewn. Even the birds played their part. A restless goshawk screeching in its cage was the perfect distraction while border guards waved its handler through. This was asymmetrical warfare at its most elegant. While authorities spent fortunes building watchtowers and hiring censors, the resistance had wings. Literally, the system was so effective that some banned works survived only because of these covert deliveries. We know of one Arabic medical text, condemned for its pagan anatomy illustrations, that reached 6 different countries via falconers before finally being copied safely in a Swiss monastery. No royal edict could compete with that kind of reach. The brilliance of using falconry routes wasn't just their secrecy, it was their unpredictability. A smuggler might take the same road twice, but a falconer's path changed with nesting seasons, weather, and the whims of their noble patrons. By the time an inquisitor traced a forbidden book to one castle, the network had already moved it along, carried by the next handler heading into the mountains. It was a game of chess where the pawns could fly. Falconers held a unique position in medieval society, trusted by the nobility yet invisible to scrutiny. Their craft demanded an air of mystery. After all, training a bird of prey wasn't just about skill, it was about understanding secrets, the quiet language of feathers and talons. That same intuition made them perfect smugglers. Take the leather satchels they carried, bulky with hoods, lures, and jesses. To the untrained eye, these were just tools of the trade. But lift the false bottom of a well-worn bag, and you might find the works of Averroes, a philosopher so controversial his ideas were banned across Christendom. The rhythm of a falconer's journey was their greatest advantage. Unlike merchants who stuck to crowded trade routes, falconers followed the migratory paths of their birds, remote, unpredictable, and utterly free from prying eyes. A stop at a monastery to deliver a freshly trained goshawk, the perfect opportunity to slip a forbidden manuscript to a scribe behind the stables, a visit to a noble's castle under the pretense of evaluating their muse. An ideal moment to trade a volume of radical poetry for a purse of silver. The system thrived on plausibility. No one batted an eye at a falconer adjusting their equipment, even if that adjustment meant transferring a book from one hidden compartment to another. But not all falconers joined this underground network willingly. Some were coerced. Imagine a handler discovering a nobleman's secret, perhaps an affair or worse, heresy. Suddenly, their silence came at a price, a single journey carrying a dangerous text. Others were true believers, risking everything for the cause of knowledge. Records from a Spanish Inquisition trial reveal one such man, a falconer named Rodrigo, who confessed under torture to smuggling over 30 books. His defense: "A mind without books is like a falcon without sky." Even as they broke his hands, he refused to name his contacts. The beauty of this operation was its simplicity. While authorities patrolled roads and searched ships, they overlooked the unassuming figure with a bird on their wrist. A falconer's authority came from their association with power. Who would dare interrogate someone who might be carrying a gift for the king? And the birds themselves played their part. A restless falcon, shrieking and flapping, could drown out the sound of a secret exchange or draw attention away from a suspicious bulge in a saddlebag. What's astonishing is how long this system endured. For over 3 centuries, falconry's elite reputation provided cover for a shadow trade in ideas. By the time authorities caught on, the damage was done. The very books they'd tried to erase had already taken root, copied and recopied in hidden scriptoriums. The falconers, those quiet architects of intellectual rebellion, had done their job too well. Their legacy wasn't just in the birds they trained, but in the minds they helped set free. A falconer's whistle might signal a bird to return, or it might be the first note in a far more dangerous melody. Behind the ordinary commands of the sport lay a second language, one where a question about a hawk's molting season could really mean, "Is the coast clear?" And a complaint about sluggish prey might hint at delayed deliveries. This wasn't just small talk, it was a survival tactic. In a world where the wrong word could mean imprisonment or worse, falconers and their allies crafted a lexicon that hid in plain sight. Take the term mew, which typically referred to a falcon's molting cage. In certain circles, it became code for a monastery's hidden scriptorium, where banned books were copied under cover of darkness. A request to exercise the goshawk might signal that a new shipment had arrived, while a comment about feeding the birdling could warn of increased patrols on the roads. Even the colors of jesses, those slender leather straps, held meaning. A handler wearing crimson might be signaling safe passage, while one with unadorned leather could indicate danger ahead. Monasteries played their part with precision. A request for a rare Saker falcon, for instance, wasn't always about prestige. It could be a discreet summons alerting the network that a new batch of forbidden texts needed transport. The birds themselves became unwitting messengers. A falcon arriving with an oddly weighted hood might carry a scrap of vellum tucked inside, its cramped handwriting detailing the next drop point. The system was so seamless that even bystanders who overheard these exchanges would dismiss them as mundane shop talk, just falconers obsessing over their craft. But the real stroke of genius, the way this language evolved, unlike rigid ciphers which could be cracked, Falconry's secret lexicon shifted like the wind. A term meaning safe house one year might refer to a specific book the next, keeping even suspected smugglers guessing. And because falconry was such a niche skill, few outside the trade could spot the patterns. To an outsider, it was all birds and weather. To insiders, every conversation was a map, a warning, or a promise. The risks of miscommunication were deadly. A single misinterpreted phrase could lead a falconer straight into an inquisitor's trap. That's why the most trusted handlers developed elaborate rituals to verify identities. Some wore rings with hidden compartments, revealing a sliver of parchment only when twisted just so. Others used the cadence of their whistles, a staccato burst instead of a lilting tune, to separate allies from strangers. It was a dance of trust where one misstep could unravel everything. What's astonishing is how few written records exist of this shadow language. Unlike the smuggled books themselves, these verbal codes left almost no trace. We only know of them through fragmented trial testimonies or the occasional slip in a noble's letter. Even then, the references are oblique, a mention of the falcon's strange cry, or a lord complaining that his handler speaks too much in riddles. The system was designed to vanish, leaving behind whispers instead of evidence. Yet its legacy lingers. Modern cryptography experts point to falconers as early pioneers of steganography, the art of hiding messages in plain sight. Their methods weren't just about words, they embedded meaning in gestures, tools, even the way a bird was carried on the wrist. In an era when knowledge was power, these handlers proved that the subtlest signals could change the world. And while their coded whistles have long faded, the idea they championed still soars. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. The route from Valencia to Toulouse was more than a path for prized peregrines, it was a clandestine highway for ideas. Spanish falconers, trusted by both Moorish and Christian nobles, moved freely across borders, their birds' leather hoods sometimes concealing more than just sharp eyes. Hidden compartments in ornate transport cages carried slim volumes of Averro's commentaries, works so controversial they'd been banned by the church. And the genius lay in the stops along the way. A hunting lodge in the Pyrenees, ostensibly for resting hawks, became a way station where manuscripts changed hands under the guise of inspecting a bird's plumage. Germany's Black Forest routes tell an even bolder story. Here, falconers exploited the dense wilderness terrain too treacherous for patrols, to shuttle forbidden texts between isolated abbeys. One Benedictine monastery near Freiburg operated as a covert hub for decades, its monks copying banned astronomy treatises while publicly breeding geofalcons for the emperor. The bird's arrival from Scandinavia provided perfect cover. Who would question crates of straw bedding when they concealed celestial charts challenging Ptolemy's universe? But perhaps the most audacious operation ran along the Alpine passes from Milan to Vienna. Falconers servicing the Habsburg court transformed icy mountain trails into a smuggling superhighway. Remote way stations, originally built to shelter birds during storms, became libraries in disguise. A handler might request fresh quail for a falcon supper, code signaling the arrival of Venetian-printed humanist works. The system grew so refined that some drop points used falconry equipment as signals. A hood left hanging on a post meant danger, while a jess coiled in a specific pattern indicated safe passage. What made these routes so resilient was their dual purpose. A noble expecting a new Merlin from Burgundy wouldn't suspect the same courier had delivered Lucretius Heretical on the nature of things to his neighbor's steward. The falconry infrastructure, groomed over generations for prestige, became the perfect Trojan horse. Breeding records show birds deliberately overworked before journeys, their lethargy justifying slower travel that allowed handlers to detour for secret deliveries. Even molting seasons played a role. When falcons shed feathers, their handlers had legitimate reasons to linger at remote mews, buying time for scribes to finish copying smuggled originals. The real stroke of brilliance, these networks mirrored nature itself. Like migratory birds, falconers followed ancient, invisible routes too ingrained to raise suspicion. A castle's demand for Icelandic gyrfalcons meant guaranteed winter crossings to the North Sea, where ships carried not just birds but crates of feed stuffed with philosophical texts. Spring migrations to breeding grounds in Hungary became opportunities to transport maps challenging church-approved geography. The system was self-perpetuating. The more elites prized exotic falcons, the more they unknowingly funded the very trade undermining their authority. Yet all shadows eventually fade. By the 16th century, the rise of printing presses and shifting political winds made bulk smuggling harder. But the legacy of these routes endured in unexpected ways. Scholars tracing the spread of Renaissance ideas found curious patterns. Radical philosophies often appeared first in towns with historic falconry schools. The very castles that once received forbidden books in birdcage later became centers of scientific inquiry. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony. The sport designed to showcase control ultimately became the vehicle for its undoing, one feather-light manuscript at a time. Henry of Navarre wasn't just a master of falcons, he was a maestro of misdirection. As a trusted handler for French and Spanish nobles, his access to their castles was unquestioned. But beneath his embroidered gloves lay a dangerous secret: Protestant texts carefully folded into the lining of his falconry bags, his most daring move. Delivering a banned translation of the New Testament to a cardinal's own niece, hidden inside the hollow perch of a prized peregrine. The irony was exquisite. The very bird gifted to secure Catholic favor became the vessel for Reformation ideas. Henry's brilliance lay in his reputation. No one suspected the man who trained hawks for kings to be smuggling heresy on the side. Then there was Sister Marguerite, a nun whose quiet rebellion reshaped an entire convent. While her sisters embroidered altar cloths, she trained the monastery's goshawks to carry more than game. Tiny scrolls of feminist philosophy, penned in her own hand, were tucked into leathered jesses before flights to neighboring abbeys. Her most famous delivery, a treatise arguing for women's education, rolled into a quill and slipped inside a falcon's hood. When confronted by suspicious priests, she'd simply stroke the bird's feathers and murmur about training imperfections. Who would accuse a nun of subversion when her hands were busy soothing a restless hawk? Even nobility played the double game. Duke Albrecht of Bavaria, famed for his lavish falconry expeditions, turned his hunting parties into covert book runs. Scientists and philosophers whispered their works into his circle, knowing his gyrfalcon's travel cages had false bottoms. One account describes a lunar atlas banned for contradicting church doctrine, smuggled past Vienna's gates disguised as falcon feed charts. The Duke's genius was turning his obsession into an alibi. When inquisitors grew suspicious, he'd host extravagant bird displays, drowning out rumors with the spectacle of 100 falcons in flight. What united these figures wasn't just courage, it was their deep understanding of falconry's unspoken rules. They knew handlers were invisible in a way merchants or scholars weren't. A noble might interrogate a visiting poet, but a falconer, they were part of the furniture, as unremarkable as a well-worn glove. This invisibility let them exploit every loophole. Henry timed deliveries during molting season, when handlers were expected to linger. Sister Marguerite scheduled exchanges on feast days when convents were too busy to notice extra activity in the Meuse. Duke Albrecht deliberately overworked his birds before journeys, justifying overnight stops where banned books changed hands. The risks they took were staggering. In an era where heresy could mean burning, these handlers walked a razor's edge. Records from Toledo's archives tell of a falconer caught with Erasmus' works sewn into a hood. His punishment was to have his hands crushed in the very tools he'd used to train birds. Yet the trade persisted because these individuals understood something profound. Ideas, like falcons, can't be caged forever. They might be grounded for a time, but eventually someone will slip the jesses and the words will take flight again. What's remarkable is how ordinary they seemed. No grand speeches, no dramatic proclamations, just quiet competence with a side of subterfuge. A nun adjusting a hood here, a duke complaining about feed quality there. The system thrived because it looked like nothing at all, and perhaps that's the lesson hidden in their stories. Sometimes the most revolutionary acts come wrapped in the mundane. A falcon's cry might signal a hunt's beginning or the start of a quiet rebellion that would outlast kingdoms. Monasteries stood at the heart of a paradox, gatekeepers of orthodoxy, yet often the quiet architects of its undoing. Behind thick stone walls, where scribes once meticulously copied psalms and gospels, a different kind of transcription began taking place. Disillusioned monks, their faith shaken by the rigid dogmas of the church, turned their scriptoriums into workshops of rebellion. Quills that had traced the word of God now danced across vellum with the dangerous ideas of Averroes, the radical poetry of Ovid, or the scientific theories condemned as heresy. And when the ink dried, these forbidden pages didn't gather dust in some hidden corner. They took flight, quite literally, in the care of falconers who arrived under the pretense of tending to the monastery's birds. The system was elegantly simple. A falconer would arrive with a prized bird for the abbot's muse, their saddlebags stuffed with the usual tools, hoods, jesses, and the occasional treat for the birds. But nestled among these mundane items might lie a volume of Aristotle's lost works, or a treatise on astronomy that placed the sun, not the earth, at the center of the universe. The exchange was swift, disguised as a routine inspection of the monastery's falcons. No one questioned why a handler needed to examine a bird in the scriptorium's anteroom, where a scribe might accidentally leave a freshly copied manuscript within reach. Some monasteries became veritable clearinghouses for banned knowledge. Take the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino, where a single monk brother in Zo orchestrated an elaborate operation beneath the oblivious gaze of his superiors. By day, he transcribed liturgical texts. By night, he copied Galilean star charts onto thin sheets of vellum, rolling them into hollowed-out quills that falconers later smuggled to universities in Padua and Bologna. The abbey's reputation as a center of falcon breeding provided the perfect smokescreen. Visitors came and went, their comings and goings chalked up to the demands of avian care. But the boldest schemes unfolded in plain sight. At Cluny Abbey, the mews weren't just for housing birds. They concealed a trapdoor leading to a subterranean library. Manuscripts banned by the Council of Trent were stored in airtight chests, brought in piecemeal over decades by falconers delivering medicinal herbs for the birds. The abbey's prized peregrines, symbols of piety, became unwitting sentinels for a trove of radical thought. Even the birds' feeding schedules played a role. The cacophony of hungry falcons at dusk masked the sound of chests being moved below. What drove these men of God to such risks? For some, it was intellectual hunger, a belief that truth couldn't be confined by doctrine. Others saw it as moral duty, smuggling texts that challenged corruption or injustice. And then there were those who simply couldn't resist the thrill of the game. One Cistercian monk, caught with a copy of Lucretius' atheistic masterpiece, reportedly told his interrogators, "If the devil can quote scripture, why can't I quote philosophy?" His punishment, a lifetime copying penitential psalms, only fueled the legend. The real genius of this partnership between monks and falconers was its asymmetry. While bishops issued decrees and burned books, the underground trade adapted like water finding cracks in stone. A crackdown on scriptoriums, falconers switched to memorizing passages, reciting them later to scribes. Increased searches at monastery gates, manuscripts were tucked into the very vestments of visiting clergy, their voluminous sleeves perfect for concealing slim volumes. The church, for all its power, was playing whack-a-mole with a network that changed shape faster than doctrine could condemn it. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the margins. Some surviving manuscripts bear tiny notes, prayers for protection, hastily scrawled by monks who knew the stakes. One psalter, now in the Vatican's secret archives, contains an illicit diagram of Copernican orbits hidden beneath a gilded illustration of the Nativity. The artist's hand must have trembled as they painted over their heresy, knowing the falconer's next visit might be their last. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were declarations of faith in knowledge, in truth, and in the unshakable belief that some ideas, once set loose, could never be caged again. The art of concealment reached near perfection in the hands of medieval falconers, where every piece of equipment held potential for deception. Take the humble wooden perch, outwardly just a resting place for a bird's talons, but in skilled hands a secret vault. Craftsmen hollowed them with painstaking precision, carving compartments so snug a folded parchment could slide in without a whisper of movement. Some even weighted the ends to mimic the natural balance of solid wood, ensuring no suspicious tilt would betray their contents. When inspectors tapped these perches, the sound echoed true. Only a handler's knowing twist could reveal the hidden seam. Bird cages became masterclasses in misdirection. A noble's ornate transport box might feature a false bottom, its compartment accessible only by pressing disguised carvings in a specific sequence. Others used the straw bedding itself, weaving treated reeds into scroll-sized tubes that looked like ordinary nesting material. The boldest designs incorporated metal linings ostensibly to reinforce the structure, but really to foil inquisitors' probes. After all, what guard would risk damaging a gyrfalcon worth a year's wages by prying too deep? Then there were the birds themselves. Larger falcons like sakers could carry thin vellum strips rolled into their leg bands, the leather softened to prevent chafing. Handlers trained them to tolerate the extra weight, gradually acclimating them to the subtle shift in balance. Some accounts even mention goshawks taught to retrieve small cylinders disguised as prey from designated drop points. A bird returning to the glove with a rabbit might actually be delivering a philosopher's latest tract, but the real brilliance lay in the larger disguises. A forbidden astronomy text could be rebound as a falconry manual, its dangerous diagrams hidden among innocent sketches of bird anatomy. The trick, meticulously altering the cover's tooling to match known treatises, right down to the wear patterns of a well-thumbed volume. Inspectors flipping through would see charts of molting cycles, never noticing the coded annotations about planetary motion tucked between the lines. Gloves offered perhaps the riskiest and most intimate method. Falconers' gloves were thick, often lined with layers of wool or silk. By carefully unpicking the stitching, smugglers could insert pages between these layers, then re-sew them with thread dyed to match the original. The sweat and oil from a handler's hands eventually aged the leather naturally, masking any tampering. One surviving pair in a Madrid museum X-ray revealed 8 pages of a banned love poem concealed this way, each word pressed close to the skin of the person who carried it. What made these techniques so effective was their adaptability. When authorities grew suspicious of perches, smugglers switched to hollow anklets, increased scrutiny of cages. Texts were rolled into feeding scoops or disguised as feather cleaning tools. The system evolved like a living thing, always one step ahead. And because falconry gear was both personal and precious, few dared dismantle it without cause. After all, accusing a royal handler of heresy required more evidence than a hunch, especially when the accuser might face the king's displeasure for damaging his favorite goshawk's equipment. The ultimate testament to their ingenuity lies in what survived. Dozens of manuscripts now in major collections bear subtle tells. A perch's wood grain that doesn't quite match, a glove stitching slightly off-kilter. These aren't flaws, they're fingerprints of the brave souls who turned their craft into a lifeline for ideas. Every crease in a hidden page, every millimeter of hollowed oak, whispers the same truth. When knowledge is at stake, even the smallest details can outsmart empires. Discovery wasn't just a setback, it was a death sentence. The moment a falconer's secret was exposed, the machinery of medieval justice ground into motion with brutal efficiency. Excommunication stripped them of spiritual solace, branding them eternal outcasts. Imprisonment often meant dank, lightless cells where the hands that once coaxed birds to flight withered in chains. And execution that could take many forms, burning for heresy, hanging for treason, or the particularly grim fate of being crushed under the weight of one's own falconry equipment, a grotesque parody of their craft. Authorities made examples of these smugglers, ensuring their punishments were as public as their crimes had been hidden. Yet the real terror lay in the unpredictability of capture. A falconer might spend years operating undetected, only to be undone by something as trivial as a loose thread on a glove or a bird's unexplained agitation. Suspicion often started with small things: a handler requesting an unusual route, a noble steward noticing ink stains on leather jesses, or a border guard growing curious about why a falconer's saddlebags weighed more coming south than going north. Some were betrayed by jealous rivals within their own ranks, while others fell victim to sheer bad luck, like the case of a Milanese handler whose secret compartment sprung open when his gerfalcon unexpectedly struck the cage during transport. The trade's resilience came from its decentralized nature. When one handler disappeared into a dungeon, 10 others adapted, refining their methods with chilling precision. After a notorious crackdown in 15th century Toledo, where 3 falconers were hanged with their own bird leashes, the network responded by switching to memorization. Texts were no longer carried physically but passed orally during falconry lessons, their words disguised as training mnemonics. A handler might murmur, "The goshawk strikes at dawn," while tapping a specific rhythm, a coded signal that later unlocked a banned verse for scribes to transcribe. What's striking is how punishments varied by region. In France, a first-time offender might lose their hands, a deliberate cruelty that ended their falconry career. German principalities preferred public humiliations, forcing smugglers to wear parchment hoods inscribed with their crimes. But the Spanish Inquisition took special interest in cases involving books, seeing them as existential threats. Trial records from Seville describe a handler who endured the strappado hoisted by his wrists behind his back while weights dragged his falconry gloves from his belt, all to extract names he never gave. The psychological toll was just as severe. Smugglers developed intricate rituals to spot surveillance, like scattering grain in specific patterns to detect followers or using bird calls to warn allies. Paranoia became their constant companion. A Bavarian falconer's diary discovered in a monastery archive contains frantic marginalia. "Does the steward watch me?" The goshawk refused the lure today. Was it an omen? Even successful missions left scars. One account tells of a woman who disguised herself as a handler for years, only to confess on her deathbed that she'd never again been able to hear a falcon's cry without trembling. Yet for all the risks, the flow of forbidden books never truly stopped. If anything, the crackdowns proved how vital these networks had become. When authorities in Augsburg burned an entire muse suspected of harboring smuggled texts, they unknowingly destroyed 30 irreplaceable manuscripts, but 50 more had already been moved to a charcoal burner's hut 2 miles away. The lesson was clear: you could break the Falconers, but not the system. Like water finding new channels after a dam, the trade simply flowed elsewhere, carried on the wings of birds and the quiet courage of those who believed some truths were worth any price. Falconry tournaments shimmered with pageantry nobles in velvet cloaks, birds in jeweled hoods, the air thick with competition. But beneath the spectacle, these gatherings pulsed with a far more dangerous energy. While lords bragged about their falcons' diving speed or wingspan, handlers moved through the crowds with quiet purpose. A compliment about a gyrfalcon's plumage might end with a folded parchment pressed into a glove. A debate over training techniques could disguise the swift transfer of a book from one satchel to another. The very grandeur of these events provided the perfect smokescreen. Who would notice a servant adjusting their belt when a count's prized peregrine was about to strike its prey? Some tournaments developed elaborate systems to facilitate these exchanges. At the annual champagne gathering, falconers used the birds themselves as signals. A handler carrying a hooded saker on their left arm meant they had contraband to deliver. A goshawk perched on a gauntlet indicated they were there to receive. The most brazen operations happened right under the judges' noses. One account describes a banned medical text, its pages carefully separated and rolled into 12 scrolls, being passed piece by piece during the scoring of a flight competition. Each time officials turned to record points, another scroll changed hands in the crowd. The real genius lay in the tournament's predictability. Unlike secretive meetings in forests or castles, these events were public, scheduled months in advance. Scholars needing rare texts could arrange for them to be brought by specific handlers competing in certain categories. A philosopher in Paris might request Avicenna's forbidden works from a Bolognese falconer, knowing they'd both be at the Whitsun tournament in Provence. The system functioned like a shadow postal service, with birds of prey as its unwitting postmarks. Certain meets gained notorious reputations. The St. Lucian competition in Burgundy became so infamous for clandestine book trades that authorities posted extra guards only to find falconers had shifted operations to the stables, using feed sacks as drop points. At Heidelberg's autumn meet, handlers developed a language of glove gestures. Touching one's thumb to the third finger meant, "I have the astronomy text," while adjusting the wrist strap signaled, "Danger, abort." The sheer volume of legitimate activity, hundreds of birds being weighed, fed, and examined, created endless opportunities for subterfuge. Even the tournament's rituals played into the smugglers' hands. The tradition of gifting birds between nobles provided cover for bulk transfers. A duke might receive a prized merlin from a neighboring lord, its ornate transport cage lined with not just velvet but carefully concealed political treatises. Banquets held after competitions turned into swapping grounds where handlers could accidentally brush past each other, manuscripts changing ownership in the space of a bow. The system thrived because it mimicked normalcy. Every gesture had plausible deniability. What's remarkable is how these public spectacles became the safest places for dangerous ideas. In an era when solitary travelers risked highway robbery or interrogation, the chaos of a falconry meet offered protection. The presence of powerful patrons discouraged searches, while the constant movement of people and birds made surveillance nearly impossible. A text that would have meant execution if found on a country road could pass freely through a cheering crowd, hidden in the one place no one thought to look: the hands of those everyone saw but nobody truly noticed. The legacy of these tournaments lingers in unexpected ways. Modern historians tracing the spread of Renaissance ideas often find a curious pattern. Radical manuscripts surface in city records shortly after major falconry events. A treatise on democratic governance appears in Florence's archives 3 days after the Medici-sponsored Palio dei Falconi. Copernicus' early notes on heliocentrism show up in Krakow within a week of the Royal Falconry Games. The connections aren't coincidences, they're the fingerprints of a rebellion that flew under the radar, its messengers wearing leather gauntlets instead of rebel colors. Perhaps the ultimate irony is what happened to the birds themselves. Long after their handlers died, many of these falcons were immortalized in tapestries and portraits, celebrated as symbols of nobility. No one painted the forbidden books they'd helped carry or the minds those books had set free. But if you look closely at some medieval artworks, you might spot a curious detail. A gyrfalcon's jest tied in an unusual knot, or a hood stitching just slightly off. To those who knew the code, these weren't artists' mistakes, they were quiet tributes to the feathered accomplices of intellectual revolution. The ripple effects of these smuggled manuscripts reached far beyond castle walls and monastery libraries. They quietly rewrote the course of history. Imagine a world where the stars still revolved around the earth, where kings ruled by unquestioned divine right, where half the population was told their minds weren't fit for learning. That was the medieval reality until forbidden books carried on falconers' wrists began chipping away at its foundations. Take Copernicus' revolutionary idea that the Earth orbits the Sun. Church authorities banned his work immediately, recognizing how it undermined their entire cosmology. But within months of the ban, handwritten summaries were circling through falconry networks. A German noblewoman's diary from 1543 describes receiving strange star charts hidden in a gyrfalcon's transport crate, charts showing planets circling the Sun, not the Earth. By the time the Church organized public burnings of Copernican texts, the damage was done. The genie was out of the bottle, or more accurately, the falcon's hood. Religious reform spread on similar wings. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to that Wittenberg church door, it wasn't just the act that shook Europe, it was the wildfire of printed pamphlets that followed. But how did those pamphlets reach villages hundreds of miles away, past regions where possession meant execution? Falconry routes provided the answer. A Lutheran sympathizer in Nuremberg might bundle pamphlets into fake falcon hoods, knowing they'd reach a sympathetic monastery via the next bird delivery. Some of Luther's most radical writings survived only because they'd been sewn into the lining of falconers' gloves before raids could confiscate them. The impact wasn't limited to science and religion. Hidden among more famous smuggled works were texts arguing for women's education, written by bold thinkers like Christine de Pizan. These manuscripts traveled a dangerous path from Parisian salons to the saddlebags of falconers serving noble households. One account tells of a French countess who received de Pizan's, the Book of the City of Ladies, disguised as a falconry manual, its feminist arguments hidden between passages about molting seasons. Within a generation, her daughters would establish one of the first schools for girls in Provence, using that very book as their curriculum. What's astonishing is how these disparate threads intertwined. A single falconer's journey might carry 3 world-changing texts at once: a Copernican star chart for an abbey's rebellious astronomer, Lutheran tracts for a sympathetic lord, and a treatise on women's rights for his curious wife. The birds didn't discriminate, they carried ideas as efficiently as they carried prey, and each delivery created unexpected alliances. A Protestant noble might fund the smuggling of a scientific text he didn't fully understand, simply because he recognized another blow against church authority. A Catholic monk might secretly copy a feminist work, not for its arguments about gender, but because its challenge to tradition resonated with his own doubts. The real measure of this network's success lies in what happened when these books finally emerged from the shadows. By the time authorities caught up with one smuggled text, a dozen copies had already been made. Ideas that should have been strangled in their crib instead took root across borders, watered by the sweat of falconers and the ink of clandestine scribes. The scientific revolution, the Reformation, even early sparks of the Enlightenment, all owe a debt to those leather-gloved couriers who turned their trade into a Trojan horse for truth. Perhaps the greatest irony, many of the nobles who employed these falconers were funding their own undoing. The same lords who demanded ever more exotic birds for their collections unknowingly bankrolled the spread of ideas that would topple the feudal system. They thought they were buying prestige. What they got was progress, and that's the enduring lesson of this story. Once knowledge takes flight, even those who clip its wings can't stop it from soaring. Jacques Leclerc wasn't just a falconer, he was a librarian of the sky. In the autumn of 1387, as French knights tightened their siege around the Provençal city of Montpellier, its famed medical university faced annihilation. The library housed treasures beyond measure: Arabic translations of Galen's anatomical studies, Persian star charts correcting Ptolemy's errors, even Avicenna's canon of medicine, a text that would later revolutionize European hospitals. But with enemy soldiers burning books as heresy, these works had days, maybe hours, before the flames reached them. Enter Leclerc, a quiet man with a reputation for training the swiftest peregrines in Languedoc. What happened next wasn't just a rescue, it was a masterclass in audacity. His plan relied on the chaos of siege warfare and the one privilege no soldier would deny: a falconer's right to exercise his birds. Each dawn, as defenders manned the walls, Leclerc would release a Saker falcon into the smoke-choked sky. While archers tracked its dramatic dives, he'd slip into the library through a side door left unguarded. There, waiting monks had already done the impossible. They disassembled entire texts, slicing vellum pages into strips no wider than a quill. These could be rolled into scrolls thin enough to nestle inside hollowed-out jesses or tucked between layers of a falcon's hood padding. The real genius, weighting each bird's equipment precisely so their flight patterns wouldn't betray the extra cargo. For 3 weeks, the operation ran like clockwork. A merlin might carry Avicenna's notes on contagion in its leg bands. A gyrfalcon's ornate perch could hide Alhazen's optics treatise. But the most daring move came when the city gates finally fell. As looting began, Leclerc loaded his last 6 birds with the heaviest prize, Ptolemy's Almagest, rebound as falconry logs. While soldiers ransacked homes, he simply walked past them, his birds screeching in their cages, the sound covering the rustle of priceless manuscripts beneath false bottoms. No one thought to check the bags of a lowly handler fleeing with his livelihood. The aftermath reads like a parable of knowledge's resilience. Those smuggled texts resurfaced in Toulouse, where Leclerc delivered them to a monastery run by his brother, a physician monk. Within a generation, the works were being copied and circulated, their ideas seeding breakthroughs. A marginal note in one manuscript credits the birdkeeper's hands for saving it, though history nearly forgot Leclerc's name. His legacy lives on in unexpected places. The curved scalpels of Renaissance surgeons modeled on Arabic designs, the star maps Columbus carried west, even the lenses Galileo ground to peer at Jupiter's moons. All traced back to a man who understood that sometimes the mightiest things travel on the quietest wings. What's remarkable isn't just Leclerc's courage, but his timing. Had those texts burned, Europe might have lost centuries of medical and astronomical progress. Instead, they became the invisible foundation for the Renaissance. The next time you hear about some grand discovery, Vesalius dissecting cadavers, Kepler plotting orbits, remember the Falconer who made it possible, because history isn't just written by kings and conquerors. Sometimes it's carried by those who know how to make knowledge fly. The golden age of falconry's secret trade began fading like autumn light, not with a sudden collapse but a gradual dimming. By the early 16th century, the rumble of printing presses across Europe changed everything. What once required painstaking manuscript copying could now be reproduced by the hundreds, making books suddenly less precious and, paradoxically, harder to control. Authorities who'd once hunted single volumes now faced floods of printed material, forcing them to shift tactics. Censorship moved from intercepting deliveries to regulating presses themselves, while falconers found their carefully guarded networks becoming obsolete. Ironically, it was technology that dealt the first blow. When Gutenberg's invention made books affordable, the economics of smuggling shifted dramatically. Why risk transporting a single precious manuscript when a printer in the next town could run off 50 copies overnight? The Falconry network's strength, its ability to move scarce, valuable items, became its weakness in an age of abundance. A Venetian printer's workshop might produce more banned books in a week than falconers could smuggle in a year, and at a fraction of the risk. Meanwhile, authorities finally connected the dots. After decades of mysterious appearances of forbidden texts in remote monasteries and noble courts, inquisitors began noticing patterns. A crackdown in Bavaria revealed 3 falconers carrying identical heretical pamphlets, all traced back to the same Strasbourg printer. In Spain, a confiscated ledger listed payments to handlers for special deliveries. The game was up. Suddenly, falconers found their equipment subjected to meticulous searches, their traditional privileges revoked. One French king even decreed that all falconry perches be made transparent. Glass replaced wood in royal mews, leaving no hollow spaces to hide contraband. New smuggling methods emerged to fill the void. Printers disguised banned works as almanacs or prayer books, shipping them in barrels of flour or bales of wool. Underground networks used coded advertisements in legal broadsheets to arrange deliveries. The very democratization of knowledge that made books cheaper also made them harder to track, as ideas spread through market stalls and coffee houses rather than clandestine birdcage. Yet for all these changes, the falconers' legacy endured. The routes they pioneered became blueprints for later smugglers. The codes they developed influenced everything from Renaissance spy networks to Enlightenment-era postal systems. Most importantly, they proved that ideas couldn't be caged forever, a lesson that would echo through the scientific revolution and beyond. The birds might have landed, but the flight of knowledge they enabled was only just beginning. Archaeologists working in a Bavarian castle's mews made a discovery that sent shivers through the academic world: a 15th-century gyrfalcon perch with its end cap loose. Inside, perfectly preserved, lay 4 tightly rolled vellum sheets. Unfurled, they revealed portions of a banned Arabic astronomy text, its margins crammed with Latin translations. The wood bore faint grooves where the scrolls had been inserted and removed repeatedly, proof this wasn't some one-time hiding spot, but a working compartment in an elaborate smuggling system. This wasn't an isolated find. In Spain, restorers cleaning a noble family's falconry gloves found the leather lining oddly stiff. Infrared scans showed why between the layers, invisible to the naked eye, were the inked outlines of a heretical poem, its letters transferred through some ingenious pressure technique onto the glove's interior. Monastic records tell their own damning stories. A ledger from Cluny Abbey lists payments to falconers for special bird provisions, an absurdity when the monastery bred its own pigeons for feed. Cross-referencing these entries with the abbey's banned book inventory reveals a chilling pattern. every major acquisition coincides with a falconer's visit. Even the birds left clues. Taxidermy examinations of medieval falcons in museum collections show some with abnormal feather wear on their legs exactly where extra-weighted jesses would have rubbed during flight. Perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from personal correspondence. A recently decoded letter between two French nobles complains about a hawkmaster who asks too many questions about our library. Another, seized by the Inquisition in Toledo, contains a noblewoman's panicked note to her sister. "Burn the little book the falcon brought last Tuesday. They are watching the muse." These aren't just stray references, they're fragments of a vast paper trail, one that historians are only now piecing together. The true smoking gun emerged in 2018 when a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped clean and reused, yielded its secrets under multispectral imaging. Beneath a boring inventory of falconry equipment lay a meticulous accounting system, dates, handlers' initials, and titles of forbidden works. One entry details Avicenna's canon, third part to Brother H. Via peregrine shipment, the record even notes the bird's name, Ghost, and its return date. This wasn't just proof of smuggling, it was their filing cabinet. What makes these discoveries so electrifying is how they confirm the system's sophistication. The hollowed-out perches weren't crude hidey holes but precision-engineered to avoid detection. The glove transfers required chemical knowledge, likely monks experimenting with invisible inks. Even the bird's training went beyond normal falconry. Those leg straps had to carry weight without affecting flight. This wasn't some ad hoc operation. It was a supply chain run with the precision of a modern logistics company, just one that dealt in contraband ideas instead of goods. Every new find rewrites our understanding of medieval intellectual life. That astronomy text in the perch, it contained corrections to Ptolemy's star charts, corrections that wouldn't be officially published for another 70 years. The poem in the gloves, a feminist critique of courtly love traditions, thought to have been suppressed before circulation. These weren't just random texts, they were the cutting-edge ideas of their day, the kind that shifted paradigms. And they moved through society not in scholars' robes, but on the wings of birds and the wrists of handlers who knew the price of knowledge and paid it willingly. The ultimate irony, many of these artifacts survived precisely because they were hidden. Manuscripts stored openly in libraries often fell to fire, war, or purges. But the book sewn into a glove's lining, the scroll tucked inside a training dummy, those survived precisely because they were too dangerous to display. Now, centuries later, their rediscovery is doing exactly what their smugglers intended, sparking conversations that authorities once tried to silence. The falconers may be dust, but their message still flies. The same tactics that let falconers slip forbidden books past castle gates would echo through history, shaping underground networks for centuries to come. Think about it, when Renaissance printers needed to distribute banned pamphlets, they didn't reinvent the wheel. They turned to the falconer's playbook, trusted couriers posing as harmless tradesmen, messages hidden in everyday objects, and routes that avoided major checkpoints. A wine merchant's barrel might conceal Reformation texts just as easily as a falcon's perch once hid heretical star charts. The principles were identical: blend in, stay quiet, and move through the blind spots of power. Consider the Huguenot book smugglers of 17th century France. Facing execution for distributing Protestant texts, they adopted falconers' tricks with chilling precision. Leather-bound Bibles were hollowed out to mimic falconry manuals, their gilt-edged pages disguised as feeding charts. Courier routes mirrored medieval muse to monastery paths, now connecting secret Protestant presses to underground congregations. Even the coded glove gestures resurfaced. A printer might adjust his cuff to signal whether authorities were watching. just as handlers once warned allies with subtle touches to their jesses. The Underground Railroad took these strategies even further. Harriet Tubman's use of bird calls to guide escaping slaves wasn't just practical, it was the spiritual heir to Falconer's whistle codes. Safe houses functioned like medieval mews, offering rest and concealment beneath a veneer of normalcy. And just as handlers exploited nobles' obsession with rare birds to move contraband, abolitionists leveraged plantation owners' pride in their thoroughbred horses, hiding freedom seekers in horse-drawn carriages meant for elite breeding stock. The parallels are uncanny because the challenges were the same: how to move precious cargo through hostile territory without getting caught. Even modern smuggling operations owe the Falconers a debt. During World War II, the French resistance used hollowed-out loaves of bread to carry microfilm, a direct descendant of the weighted falcon perches that balanced hidden manuscripts. Cold War spies adopted the medieval practice of dead drops in remote locations, exchanging information at abandoned hunting lodges instead of monastery stables. The tools changed, but the tradecraft remained. A 21st-century drug courier hiding contraband in a pet carrier is playing the same psychological game as a 15th-century handler, banking on guards' reluctance to disturb a noble's prized gyrfalcon. What made these tactics so enduring was their psychological brilliance. Falconers understood that the best disguise isn't invisibility, it's mundanity. People notice what's unusual, not what fits their expectations. A traveler with a bird on their wrist was part of the landscape, just as a milk wagon driver or a nun might be centuries later. The real innovation wasn't the hiding places themselves, but the insight that authority figures rarely question the tools of their own status symbols. Kings trusted falconers because falconry symbolized power. Slave patrols didn't search horse carriages because wealthy whites owned them. Border guards waved through familiar tradesmen because commerce depends on their movement. The ultimate testament to this legacy, some terms from medieval falconry still linger in modern intelligence work. A handler managing agents, a muse as slang for a safe house, even calling a successful operation a clean kill, all borrow from the lexicon of those who first turned hunting birds into instruments of subterfuge. When a CIA operative today studies the patterns of border patrols to time a drop, they're walking the same mental paths as a long-dead falconer, calculating which monastery's muse had the least oversight. The birds may have left the picture, but their shadows stretch across history, dark wings still guiding the flow of forbidden knowledge. The falconer, tightening the straps on his glove, faced more than physical danger. He carried the weight of impossible choices. While some handlers joined the book trade out of conviction, others found themselves trapped between loyalty and survival. Take the case of a young apprentice in 14th century Toulouse, forced into smuggling after witnessing his master's murder by a nobleman. The boy's options: stay silent and transport forbidden texts, or join his mentor in an unmarked grave. His story wasn't unique. Church records from Avignon detail at least 7 falconers who took up the trade under threat, their skills making them perfect targets for blackmail by scholars desperate to preserve knowledge. Yet for every coerced participant, there were those who saw smuggling as sacred work. A Bavarian falconer's diary, discovered in a monastery attic, describes nights spent memorizing passages from banned medical texts before journeys. "If my bird carries even one cure to the next village," he wrote, "then the noose around my neck is worth the price." These handlers didn't just move books, they saw themselves as healers, delivering intellectual medicine to a world sick with ignorance. The same hands that soothed panicked goshawks might spend evenings stitching Aristotle's lost works into saddle blankets, each stitch a silent protest against thought control. The moral calculus of their trade grows even murkier when considering collateral damage. When Spanish authorities arrested a handler in 1492, his teenage son, unaware of his father's double life, was tortured for information he didn't possess. Was preserving a copy of Lucretius' atheistic poetry worth that boy's broken fingers? Some falconers clearly thought so, believing ideas had greater longevity than individual lives. Others withdrew after such incidents, their consciences shattered alongside their families. Modern parallels sharpen these dilemmas. Like the Falconer smuggling Galileo's star charts, today's whistleblowers weigh personal ruin against public good. The medieval handler hiding manuscripts in bird cages and the journalist encrypting files face the same existential question. When does loyalty to truth override obedience to power? Both operate in shadows, both gamble with freedom, and both force societies to confront uncomfortable realities. What's often overlooked is how these choices rippled through generations. A single falconer's decision to transport Vesalius' anatomical drawings could influence medical practice for centuries. The Provençal handler who refused to carry feminist texts might have delayed women's education in her region by decades. These weren't just personal moral quandaries, they were pivot points in the slow arc of progress. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the falconers who left no records at all. The nameless handlers who disappeared into dungeons or faded into obscurity, their contributions known only by the books that survived. Their silent sacrifices echo in every modern debate about censorship, reminding us that the freedom to read was never free. It was bought with leather gloves gripping reins a little too tightly, with quickened heartbeats at border checks, and with the quiet courage of those who decided some truths deserved wings. A noblewoman adjusting her falcon's hood wasn't just preparing for a hunt, she might be signaling the next move in an underground operation. While medieval falconry was dominated by men, women carved out spaces of surprising influence in the shadowy book trade. Take Elena of Aquitaine's court, where aristocratic women bred peregrines as a fashionable hobby. Their falconry gardens became ideal cover for exchanges. A lady passing a slim volume to her handler under the pretense of inspecting a bird's plumage raised no eyebrows. But these weren't just idle nobles dabbling in rebellion. Some, like Marguerite de Navarre, used their status to shield entire networks. When her falconers were stopped by the king's guards, a single word from her could turn suspicion into deference. Convents provided another unlikely hub. While monks dominated scriptoriums, nuns with falconry connections, often from noble families, became critical scribes and informants. Sister Clara of Montpellier's letters reveal how she trained the convent's merlins to carry tiny scrolls between abbeys, their leg bands stuffed with fragments of banned poetry. Unlike male handlers who faced routine searches at city gates, nuns transporting birds for medicinal purposes were waved through without question. The very assumptions that confined women, that they were too pious or uneducated for subversion, became their greatest asset. The most daring operatives blurred lines entirely. Johanna of Flanders, a merchant's widow, took over her late husband's falconry business to maintain its smuggling routes. Her account books, discovered in a Bruges archive, show coded entries like 2 geofalcons with special feed, later proven to reference deliveries of humanist texts. Other women exploited gender distractions. A handler's wife in Cologne famously smuggled a dismantled Bible in her elaborate headdress while loudly complaining about her husband's birds, drawing attention to her theatrics rather than her hidden cargo. What's tragic is how history erased their contributions. Trial records refer to female accomplices only as the falconer's woman or the nun. The Spanish Inquisition's logs describe interrogating a noblewoman about her bird whims without ever naming her. Yet without these women, the network would have collapsed. They provided safe houses in their manor kitchens where guards wouldn't think to search. They memorized texts when carrying written copies grew too risky. And they taught their daughters the craft, ensuring the system outlasted any single generation. Modern researchers are finally piecing together their stories. Marginalia in smuggled manuscripts notes about the lady's quick hands or her grace's sharp eyes hint at their roles. A restored painting in a Prague museum shows a noblewoman with a goshawk, its jesses tied in a complex not now recognized as a smuggling signal. These fragments form a patchwork testament to women who turned society's underestimation into their most powerful weapon. While kings burned books and bishops raged against heresy, it was often a woman's steady hands that ensured the pages survived folded into a glove, stitched into a saddle, or carried on the wings of the birds they were never supposed to master. Falcons perched on the wrists of kings, emblems of power and control, yet their wings carried something far more subversive, the seeds of rebellion. These birds, trained to obey every whistle and return to their handlers, became accidental symbols of the very freedom their owners sought to suppress. There's a poetic justice in the fact that creatures bred to showcase aristocratic dominance ended up embodying the opposite, the unstoppable flight of ideas. When a gyrfalcon soared over castle walls, it wasn't just chasing prey, it was enacting a metaphor. The same skies that rulers claimed as their hunting grounds became highways for the thoughts they tried to erase. Consider the peregrine, fastest of all falcons, diving at speeds that blurred vision. Its lethal precision made it a favorite of nobles, but that same speed turned it into the perfect smuggler's ally. A manuscript hidden in its transport cage could cross a kingdom before authorities even thought to sound the alarm. The bird's very nature, untamable at heart despite its training, mirrored the resilience of forbidden knowledge. You could hood a falcon, leash it with jesses, but the moment it took flight, it answered to something deeper than human command. So too with the books they carried. Once out in the world, their ideas took on lives of their own. The irony cuts deeper when you examine Falconry's rituals. Every aspect was designed to showcase control, the leather hoods blocking sight, the careful weighing of meals to keep birds just hungry enough to obey. Yet these trappings of domination hid a profound vulnerability. A handler's authority relied on the bird's willingness to return, a fragile contract between wildness and trust. That tension made falcons the perfect doubles for intellectual rebellion. The moment a noble's prized Saker falcon landed on a smuggler's glove, it became a living contradiction, a creature of privilege, yes, but also a silent accomplice to the dismantling of that very privilege. Art from the period tells a revealing story. Tapestries show falcons striking down prey, their talons sharp as daggers, but look closer. Some artists hid subtle details, a jest tied in an unusual knot, a hood stitching forming a tiny, defiant motto. These weren't mistakes, they were quiet acts of solidarity. Even the church's own illuminated manuscripts sometimes slipped in subversive imagery. One psalter depicts a falcon releasing its quarry mid-flight, the falling bird transformed into an open book. The message was clear. Once unleashed, knowledge could not be called back. Perhaps the most striking symbolism lay in the bird's migratory patterns. Falcons followed ancient routes no king could alter, their paths crossing borders and empires with effortless grace. A gyrfalcon nesting in Iceland one season might winter in a German duke's muse the next, oblivious to the human conflicts below. Handlers exploited these natural highways, timing deliveries to migrations. In doing so, they turned the birds into something transcendent, not just carriers of ideas, but proof that some forces defy containment. When a smuggler whispered to his falcon before release, he wasn't just giving commands, he was participating in a ritual far older than feudalism, one where the sky belonged to no one and everyone at once. The legacy lingers in our language: to fly under the radar, to soar above restrictions, and these phrases owe more to medieval falconers than we realize. Even the modern concept of a dead drop traces back to handlers leaving messages in remote eyries, trusting the birds to find their way. The falcons themselves are gone from this equation, but their spirit remains. They remind us that the most potent symbols often wear disguises, that tools of control can become instruments of liberation. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson: no leash, no matter how finely crafted, can ever fully clip the wings of a mind set on flight. Centuries ago, a falconer slipping a forbidden manuscript past castle guards faced the same fundamental challenge as a modern activist bypassing internet firewalls: how to move truth through barriers built to stop it. The instruments have changed, from hollowed-out perches to encrypted hard drives, but the dance between control and liberation plays on. Where medieval authorities burned books, today's powers deploy shadow bans and search engine demotions, silencing ideas without the spectacle of flames. Yet the core dilemma remains unchanged. Knowledge, once airborne, defies containment. Consider the parallels in tactics. Medieval handlers exploited nobles' obsession with falconry to avoid scrutiny. Today's digital smugglers hide subversive code in viral memes or gaming platforms, leveraging society's distractions as camouflage. A 15th-century monk might stitch heretical texts into glove linings, while a 21st-century journalist embeds sensitive files in innocuous cloud storage under false metadata. Both understand that survival depends on making dangerous content look mundane, whether it's Aristotle's philosophy disguised as bird-feeding charts or leaked documents masquerading as cat videos. The gatekeepers have evolved too. Where once robed clerics dictated which books threatened the moral order, now algorithms silently throttle content based on opaque parameters. A medieval inquisitor might cross-examine a suspect about their reading habits. Today's platforms deploy sentiment analysis to flag problematic phrases. Both systems share a common weakness: they assume control is absolute. Just as falconers turned the church's own infrastructure, monasteries, noble courts, into conduits for rebellion, modern counterparts exploit tech giants' tools. Virtual private networks mimic the backroad routes of medieval handlers, while decentralized blockchain archives serve as digital equivalents of those hidden monastery scriptoriums, preserving what authorities would erase. What's truly striking is how both eras reveal the futility of suppression. The Church's index of prohibited books inadvertently created a thriving black market for forbidden texts, just as modern censorship often amplifies the very ideas it tries to silence through strace and effects. When a Spanish bishop burned Avicenna's medical texts, handwritten copies spread faster via falconers. When a government bans a social media platform, encrypted alternatives flourish. The mechanisms differ: feather quills versus fiber optics, but the outcome echoes. Attempts to extinguish ideas only scatter their sparks further, yet there's a crucial difference in scale. A medieval smuggler might save a dozen manuscripts in a lifetime. Today, a single click can unleash libraries across continents. This acceleration terrifies modern censors as much as it empowers dissidents. Authorities once feared the lone falconer reaching a monastery. Now they dread the viral tweet that bypasses borders at light speed. But with this speed comes new vulnerabilities where a handler could vanish into the woods if pursued. Digital trails are harder to erase. The falconer's greatest asset was being overlooked. Today's information runners must actively fight surveillance states that never blink. The most profound lesson from this comparison isn't about technology, it's about human nature. Both eras prove that controlling knowledge requires controlling curiosity, and that's a battle no authority can win. The Church couldn't stop monks from peering at smuggled star charts any more than modern regimes can stop citizens seeking VPNs. The Falconers of old and the hacktivists of today are kindred spirits united by a simple truth: build a wall around ideas and someone will always find wings to soar over it. Their tools may evolve, but their defiance remains eternal, a quiet promise that no matter how heavy the chains, minds will always find ways to fly free. The idea of Falconers as medieval book smugglers sounds like something ripped from a fantasy novel, cloaked figures passing forbidden scrolls under the cover of night. No wonder some dismiss it as romantic fiction, but the proof is in the parchment. Take the case of a French monastery's ledger from 1421, unearthed in the 1990s. Its dry accounting of cloak repairs for the Falcon Master seemed innocuous until conservators noticed odd ink stains on the pages. Infrared imaging revealed what the scribe had originally written before altering it: payments for Greek texts in 5 parts, delivered alongside new peregrines. This wasn't some grand conspiracy, it was clerical drudgery hiding in plain sight. Skeptics often point to the lack of smoking gun evidence. No medieval police reports titled "Falconer caught with heresy in his gloves." But that's precisely the point. The system thrived on being unremarkable. When inquisitors in Cologne raided a noble's mews in 1508, they found nothing but bird feed and spare jesses. Only decades later did a restorer discover the hollowed-out perch, its interior still flecked with vellum fragments. These weren't the theatrics of a secret society. They were the careful, quiet acts of ordinary people exploiting the one privilege their profession afforded: the freedom to move unseen. At the other extreme lie overblown claims that falconry networks were the medieval equivalent of an intelligence agency, with handlers as master spies orchestrating continent-wide operations. The truth is far more human. Most smugglers worked in isolated pockets, their connections fragile as the threads stitching hidden compartments. A Bavarian handler might know one sympathetic monk in Freiburg. A Spanish falconer could trust a single bookseller in Toledo. These weren't cells in some vast underground, they were scattered links in a chain that sometimes held, sometimes broke. What's often overlooked is how haphazard success could be. A single manuscript might pass through 20 hands over a century, surviving storms, raids, and sheer dumb luck. The 12th century copy of Lucretius, On the Nature of Things, that resurfaced in Florence. It spent 30 years lost in a nobleman's attic after the falconer who transported it died of plague mid-journey. Other texts vanished simply because a handler got cold feet and burned them. This wasn't some flaw in the system, it was the system. Fragility kept it alive. Authorities hunting organized rings found only disconnected individuals, each with plausible deniability. The real impact wasn't in dramatic revolutions but in slow, persistent erosion. A single smuggled astronomy text might reach one curious monk who'd copy its star charts into the margins of a prayer book. Decades later, those notes could inspire a scholar to question church doctrine. Like water seeping through cracks, these ideas didn't smash walls. They dissolved them molecule by molecule. When Copernicus finally published his sun-centered model in 1543, he stood on the shoulders of countless unnamed handlers who'd kept celestial knowledge alive during the centuries it was forbidden. Perhaps the greatest myth is that this trade died with the Middle Ages. Walk through any modern protest or underground press, and you'll see the same principles at work: trusted couriers, messages hidden in mundane objects, the exploitation of authorities' blind spots. The tools have changed: encrypted drives instead of hollow perches, social media algorithms instead of migratory bird routes, but the dance remains, because ultimately, the story of falconers and forbidden books isn't about the past. It's about the endless human ingenuity that ensures one truth will always outsoar repression. Ideas once airborne can never be fully called back to fist. Digging into this hidden history today feels like tracking a falcon's flight path. You need patience, sharp eyes, and a sense of where to look. The trail begins in the quiet corners of monastery archives, where centuries-old ledgers gather dust. These aren't just records of prayers and tithes, they're treasure maps. Look for entries that don't quite add up: payments to falconers for special supplies, or sudden repairs to mews that never housed birds. One Benedictine ledger from Burgundy lists a shipment of 5 gyrfalcons with extra feed, but cross-referencing reveals the monastery hadn't kept falcons in decades. Their feed was likely code for something far more dangerous. Falconry guild records are another goldmine, though reading them requires decoding medieval doublespeak. Membership rolls might note handlers with suspiciously frequent travels or those who paid dues in books instead of coin. In Lubeck's guild archives, a marginal doodle of a hooded falcon turned out to be a clever cipher. When overlaid with a tracing of constellations, it pointed to a cache of smuggled astronomy texts. Even mundane items like equipment inventories can hide secrets. A Lisbon museum recently discovered that a 15th century perch, long displayed as a simple training tool, had compartments lined with fragments of a banned Arabic medical treatise. Personal letters are where the human drama leaps off the page. Noble families corresponded endlessly about their birds, but between the lines you'll find panic and subterfuge. A newly translated letter from a French duchess complains that her falconer asks too many questions about our library's odd shelves, a clear reference to illicit deliveries. Other letters use falconry metaphors as cover. When a Spanish count writes of his goshawk carrying heavy prey, he's likely not talking about rabbits. Modern technology is revolutionizing this detective work. Multispectral imaging, a technique that captures light wavelengths invisible to the naked eye, has uncovered palimpsests in falconry manuals where original text was scraped away. At Oxford's Bodleian Library, researchers found a training manual with eerie gaps. Under infrared, the blank spaces bloomed with notes about delivery routes and safe houses. Even X-rays are revealing surprises. That ornate gauntlet in a Vienna museum, scans showed layers of parchment sewn between the leather, preserving a radical feminist poem thought lost to history. Amateur historians have thrilling opportunities too. Local church archives often hold overlooked gems, like a parish priest's diary noting the Falcon Master's midnight visits. Digital tools make collaboration easier than ever. Online forums connect hobbyists decoding marginalia, while open-access databases let you cross-reference bird shipments with the sudden appearance of controversial texts in distant libraries. One enthusiast in Provence recently traced a banned herbal's journey by matching ink stains in a monastery ledger to plant residue inside a falconry bag. The key is thinking like a smuggler. Follow the money, the gaps, the oddities. Why would a falconer need 3 different sets of jesses for one bird? Why does a noble's account book list payments to a handler long after his prized falcon died? These aren't clerical errors, they're breadcrumbs, and with every discovery, we're reclaiming stories that were never meant to be told, proving that even the most carefully buried truths can still take flight. The legacy of these falconers lingers not in grand monuments or history books, but in the quiet foundations of modern thought. Picture this, a university lecture hall where students debate Copernican astronomy, a laboratory where researchers test vaccines based on medieval Arabic medical texts, a woman reading feminist philosophy, none of this would exist as we know it without those leather-gloved intermediaries. These handlers, dismissed as mere servants in their time, were the midwives of the Renaissance, the uncredited architects of the Enlightenment. Their greatest achievement wasn't just moving books, it was reshaping the trajectory of human understanding itself. Consider the sheer scale of their impact. When the church banned Roger Bacon's writings on optics in the 13th century, falconers smuggled fragments to monasteries across Europe. Centuries later, those very texts inspired the lenses Galileo would turn toward the stars. A single volume of Avicenna's medical encyclopedia, hidden in a falcon's traveling cage, might pass through 20 hands before reaching a surgeon in Padua, where its descriptions of germ theory would save countless lives from infection. The ideas these handlers preserved didn't just survive, they became the building blocks of modernity. What's astonishing is how their methods foreshadowed modern information networks. Today's digital activists use encryption to bypass censorship. Falconers used hollowed-out perches and coded glove gestures. WikiLeaks' dead drops have their medieval counterparts in remote hunting lodges where manuscripts changed hands. Even the concept of going viral has roots in this trade. A single book smuggled into a university town could spawn dozens of handwritten copies within months, spreading faster than authorities could contain. The tools have changed, but the dance between suppression and dissemination remains eerily familiar. Yet history has all but erased their contributions. Scroll through the indexes of standard intellectual histories, and you'll find chapters on monks, scholars, even noble patrons, but falconers, their footnotes at best. Part of this oversight stems from their deliberate invisibility. Success meant leaving no trace, but there's also a deeper bias at work. Societies celebrate thinkers, not their couriers, as if ideas exist in some disembodied realm untouched by human hands. We remember the names of philosophers but forget the handlers who braved torture to deliver their words. The falconer's true monument lies in the unbroken chain of curiosity they safeguarded. Every time a student reads Galileo's star charts or a doctor consults an ancient anatomical drawing, they're touching the end point of a journey that began with someone's gloved hands slipping a manuscript into a birdcage. These weren't just delivermen, they were the immune system of intellectual history, carrying the antibodies of knowledge through centuries of ideological plagues. Perhaps the most poetic justice is how thoroughly they outmaneuvered their oppressors. The nobles who prized falconry as a symbol of control unknowingly funded the very ideas that would dismantle feudalism. The church that burned books couldn't burn the skies where falcons carried their cargo. And while kings and popes lie buried with their decrees, the ideas those decrees tried to erase still saw proof that no cage, no matter how gilded, can ever fully contain the human mind. Today's digital firewalls and medieval castle gates aren't as different as they seem. Both represent attempts to control the flow of ideas, and both have been outmaneuvered by those willing to repurpose everyday systems. The Falconer's story resonates because it reveals a timeless truth. Oppression thrives on predictability, while resistance flourishes in adaptability. Modern activists navigating internet blackouts or state surveillance are playing the same game as those 15th century handlers, just swapping hollowed-out perches for encrypted USB drives hidden in mundane objects. Consider how contemporary whistleblowers exploit gaps in bureaucratic systems, much like falconers leveraged their invisible status. A medieval handler's leather satchel avoided scrutiny because it was part of the background. Today, sensitive data slips past sensors disguised as grocery lists in cloud storage or encoded in gaming app metadata. The tactics evolve, but the principle remains. The most effective camouflage isn't invisibility, it's banality. When Chinese citizens share censored news through innocuous-looking tofu recipes on social media, they're channeling the same ingenuity that had monks hiding radical theology in falcon feeding manuals. This history also exposes the fragility of information control. Authorities, whether medieval bishops or modern algorithms, rely on static systems to enforce restrictions. But living networks adapt. When the church banned books, the Falconers' routes shifted like riverbanks in a storm. Similarly, when Turkey blocked Twitter in 2014, users were routed through SMS and VPNs within hours. These aren't just technical workarounds, they're manifestations of a deeper pattern. Human creativity will always outpace institutional rigidity. The parallels extend to psychological warfare. Just as inquisitors tried to terrify handlers with public executions, modern regimes use draconian sentences to chill dissent. Yet both eras prove fear has diminishing returns. After Spanish authorities crushed a smuggler's hands, 10 others took his place. When Russia jails journalists, encrypted dead drops multiply. The calculus is identical. For every person silenced, more recognize the stakes. A Breton falconer's diary captures this spirit perfectly. They may take my gloves, but the birds still know their way home. Perhaps the most urgent lesson lies in decentralization. Falconry networks thrived because they were amorphous, no central leader to capture, no headquarters to raid. Modern activist movements mirror this structure, with hashtags replacing the coded glove signals of medieval muse. From Arab Spring organizers using burner phones to Hong Kong protesters coordinating via airdrop, today's resistance thrives on the same principle: diffuse, adaptable, and resilient as a murmuration of starlings. But this legacy isn't just for dissidents. Every librarian preserving banned books, every IT worker circumventing firewalls to share academic papers, even parents teaching children censored history, all are inheritors of this tradition. The Falconers' real triumph wasn't in the texts they saved, but in proving that systems designed for control can be hacked for liberation. Their story whispers across centuries: if you can't break the gates, find the hidden door. And if there isn't one, build wings.